When my father sent some photographs to Harry in Stockholm, and Harry wrote back immediately to thank him and say, now I can prove that I had a mother and that I existed before I arrived in Sweden. And they corresponded for a long time after that, and they traded memories about their childhood and argued a little bit about who did what to when and where. They criticized a lot of politicians. They gave each other book recommendations. And they began to share details of their lives that they shared with each other, but as far as I can tell, probably Harry didn't explain any to the people that he was closest to in Stockholm, and there were stories that my father had never told my brother or me. And even the way they closed their letters as their correspondence went on really revealed how close they became to each other. When they first wrote, they signed the letters off with best regards, and then later on with goodbye, old friend. And then in one of Harry's last letters to my father, he said, well, now I have to control my misanthropy, and the best way to do it is to wish you all the best. And so I suggested to Jannike, after we talked a couple times, that she enter the film in the festival, but I made it clear that we as board members had no role in the programming, and that was really the staff's job. And I was really delighted when Lexi told me that it was absolutely a no-brainer to accept the film into the festival and to invite them here. So before we go on, I just want to give a couple of thanks. First to our sponsor, the Barbro Osher Pro Suecia Foundation, to our staff for continuing to make such great programming decisions, to all the volunteers who get us in and out of the theater so gracefully, and finally to Jannike for including a photograph of my dad in the film and for representing his debut on the big screen.
I'm wondering, Jannike, if you could start and tell us a little bit about the origins of this project. It's 10 years, or maybe you began the film earlier, but it's roughly 10 years since he passed away. And I'm wondering, you know, how did this project come about, and what were your original thoughts about making it?
Actually, it came about 2 years ago. We started it, and the idea, well, actually started with something which is not included in the film, because there were a lot of things happening after his death. There was a very much publicized trial regarding the contents of his will. There was many versions of this will, and there was the last version provoking the entire trial, which was found by a housemaid, and which was found to be not real. So there were a lot of famous people that you also saw in this movie interviewed that were testifying in this trial. And then after that, there was another crime committed, which someone, you know, burnt down a bit of his house, the villa, which you see here. Because it was going to be sold on an auction, not on an auction, it was sold by this, his last partner in life. And someone wanted to make changes that weren't allowed, so he burned it down. So there were like 2 of these trials. I read some of the transcripts from these trials, and I was talking to the producer, who is not here with us today, Rebecca Hamburger. And she thought that sounded like a good idea for a film. And then Maud and Kersti was on into the project, and we started talking about it, and we said, but really, this is not the story. I mean, the story is the truly fascinating life and times, not least of Harry Schein. So we tried to include this story for a while, and then we decided, nah, that's got really nothing to do with what we want to tell. So that's how it came about.
Excellent. Okay, that sheds a lot of light, because one of my questions was going to be, what happened with the foundation? But I love the fact that you started from that place and then decided to make a film about this incredible, extraordinary life. I wanted to know if you could talk for a moment about the archival footage. You know, there's so much treasure in this film. Who was responsible for unearthing it? Is this preserved and organized and readily available at the Institute, or did you have to search beyond?
We have searched so much, you know, it's like there, but the archives are quite organized in Sweden. There is the Social Democrats archive, where Harry put everything, all his letters, his bills, and everything he put in that archive. And that's, as a filmmaker, when you make a film about someone that's dead, you have all this thinking, does he really want you to read all this? But when he left this to this archive, okay, when you know that he left all his stuff to this archive, you know that he wanted people to go in and do something about his life. So we have been in lots of archives, and the television archive in Sweden, and
and then, yes, the Swedish television has a really good archive. There is also the National Museum of the National Library. They also have a moving image archive, and all the counties usually also have museums that have archives where private citizens can donate. You know, you find a couple of rolls of Super 8 film. So some of it is actually private citizens' footage that has been donated. And then we searched YouTube. YouTube is fantastic. You can search all kinds of things on YouTube. The thing then, the great feat, is that then you have to find out who actually owns the rights and where are the originals. So, and we had a researcher who was doing that work once we've found something that we wanted. And of course, some of it was so expensive we had to not use it, and then some things worked out. And then it might be added too that some of the stuff relating to his childhood in Vienna, we had images from his nephew who is interviewed here, who lives in Seattle, and so he had a lot of family photos, etc. And also the letters that were supplied by Dan Wohlfeiler and Peter,
Thank you, Dan.
His brother. So we looked high and low.
Yeah, and so in terms of constructing this in the edit, it's interesting bookends that, you know, we start out with his Jewish identity and early family history, and then, you know, he makes a turn and converts into the Swedish church, and it looks like at the end of his life he's coming back around to, you know, sort of come out and acknowledge his Jewish identity, especially within the context of the reaction, you know, in Swedish society. So I'm wondering if you could talk about what you learned about, you know, his relationship to Jewish identity, and how you think Swedish audiences who are seeing this relate to that or think about it. If it's been, you know, shown in Sweden, I'm assuming it has.
Yeah, initially we were, puzzled by the fact that he so vehemently rejected the story of his Jewish past, and he, for example, he said to one of his close friends that his mother had died, you know, from a heart attack, which of course was not the case. She was sent to Theresienstadt, and that's where his whole family vanished. So, to us, this was certainly interesting to explore, because Harry himself, having written so much of autobiographical material, he so rarely touched on this. So this was, sort of a taboo issue. So of course we wanted to dig deeper in there, and that's really the, the rosebud of Harry Schein, and that's why we also call the film Citizen Schein, because it was another media mogul with a rosebud.
And also, when he stuck his chin out a lot, he was not afraid to say what he wanted or to be perceived as arrogant, and that's when he also got the anti-Semitic kind of backlash. Even in the early 70s, he was never openly saying that he was Jewish, but he had a heavy Austrian accent throughout his life. He spoke fluent Swedish, but had this heavy accent, so everybody knew he was a foreigner. And then his name kind of betrayed his Jewish heritage. And when he stuck his chin out and did something that kind of the general public didn't like criticizing popular but not maybe so great movies, that's what they hit him with. Like you saw, he sent postcards. This was in 1974. sending postcards of Jude and Schein, and so he was aware of it. He was very afraid of anti-Semitic prosecution, as he had told his sister. And even when he was openly speaking out against the neo-Nazi movement that was emerging in Europe in the early 90s, and he was really an expert, someone who he was going on panels and talking about this and what was happening in Yugoslavia too, former Yugoslavia. He never addressed it from a position of personal experience. He addressed it as someone who could argue very well and analyze what was going on, but he'd never entered his own experience into those arguments, which he could have easily done, like in the clip that we have in the film where he says, ask the people whose families have been murdered. And he doesn't say, ask me, you know. So that was very interesting to us.
His take on it was, Hitler made me a Jew.
So in terms of the Swedish response, 10 years out after his death, what do you think the perception and legacy of his story is now? And has the film contributed to the national thinking about his role in the culture and in, you know, film history in Sweden in general?
Yeah, it's still on. It have premiere in March, and it's still on cinema, so we're happy for that. And but it's like for Swedes, it's like a lesson of the culture history, what's happened, and also about this close world of the men with power that was in Sweden, with the culture where we have Ingmar Bergman that's decided nearly everything. If you have him against you. He was the boss of the theater. He decides everything with sin. He was best friend with Harry. It was very close, and they sort of ruled Sweden together with Olof Palme and all this. So this network, it's for Swedes, it's interesting to see because people are speaking much more openly about this than they did when these people were alive. So you can't understand that, but for Swedes, that's put it in that context. And also something we didn't know when we were doing the film, that the situation with refugees will change so dramatical during this period, because there was coming a lot of what do you call it, children, refugee children, really, without parents to Sweden. And suddenly he was a refugee coming 50 years earlier. Yeah. And he built his, how much, so many, it must be 70 years earlier or something, yes. Yeah. And how he built his trip and what he actually did for Sweden. You know, so it was this discussion about youth coming alone and how their possibilities to get into the Swedish society is today and how it was. So it also getting a actual,
Yeah, so the film really takes on a contemporary relevance.
Yeah, that we didn't know when we started. So that was one of the topics that was...
Yeah, that's amazing. Really the discussion of asylum and citizenship and assimilation and bringing in new cultural communities into a culture that maybe didn't have so many waves in the past. So yeah, I think that's a conversation I think we're all having here as well and all over the world, really looking at stories of the past to inform the present. I had another question just about a little bit about the family response, if the nephew that we see in the film has seen it, and the family response to the film.
Yeah, the family consisting then of Tom Lonner, and he has two brothers, but they weren't involved, so he's the family. Okay. Really, since he had no children or no other relations. But he was extremely enthusiastic about the film and thought we had made a good analysis. He wrote us a many pages long review, and yeah, so I think he was pretty happy about it, although he didn't really meet with Harry over extended periods, but on several occasions. But of course he had the stories from his mother and, well, his own conclusions from these meetings.
Yeah, and I thought that was really additive in the film as well, even though it's a smaller presence. So I know our audience is going to have a lot of questions, so we will come find you with a microphone. Just raise your hands, and let's take a few.
I have two questions. First of all, did Sweden, I'm assuming you would know this, but did Sweden actually accept adult refugees that were in danger from anti-Semitism? And then my second question is, I was curious how the sister and her husband managed to get out and get to the United States, and did that family identify as Jewish, including the nephew? Thank you for a wonderful film. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, the first question. Sweden was fairly Nazi-struck, I would say, before the war. And there was big resistance to accepting Jewish refugees during the war that were adults. And I think that the total number of minors that was entered into was like 500, so it's not a lot. But right after the war, a lot of the survivors and were accepted into Sweden, right? Is that, yeah. Yeah. Did everybody hear that? So during the war, no. 500 minors, that's it. After the war, big change of attitude. A lot of Jewish survivors were welcomed to Sweden and made their lives there. With regards to your other question, the sister, her husband, she got married, and he was, I'll leave it, this is a little sketchy. She got out later to the US.
Without getting too detailed, it's a fantastic story. It's another film altogether, because the sister, as you mentioned, she was married to one Gottlieb, who was the son of a woman, are you following me, who was the mistress of Albert Einstein. And yeah, so it is, because they were very wealthy, and Einstein, already having become a big name and moved to California, etc., he, so through his dealings and intervention, he managed to get this Gottlieb out, the mother, of course, Gottlieb's mother, out of a camp, which must have been pretty exceptional. And exactly how she got to the States, I know she went by Paris and Portugal, and actually she didn't flee until 41, so it's a bit mysterious how it was possible to do that at that time.
The middle right here.
Obviously...
No. Oh, that's right. No, she didn't really identify. She converted to Catholicism back when she was in Vienna. I don't know about Mr. Gottlieb, but she was a devout Catholic through her life.
Great, we have one on the middle right.
Well, the film shows that Schein had many liaisons with beautiful and intelligent Swedish women, and that they adored him. He was catnip to Swedish women. And even now, all of you filmmakers are women and find him, are intrigued by this man. And we know that Northern Europe has virtually zero birth rate, but how do you explain that none of these women wanted to have a child with him?
You mean that none of them wanted to? Or, yeah, okay, well, Ingrid, the longest lasting marriage, because they were actually married to each other 33 years, although they didn't see that much of each other. She did, according to what we have been able to find out, want to have children. Even with Harry, as it turned out, but she couldn't, or they couldn't.
There might have been some. He actually had it's in his autobiography. He writes a very funny story about his first real relationship with a woman. He was dating her for a couple of years in his early 20s, And she was constantly afraid of getting pregnant. And it's a funny story of how every time her period was a little late, she would eat strychnine and do jumping jacks. But she was actually never, ever, it was always a false alarm. And there are some people that have speculated that he actually couldn't have children.
We have 3 more questions in the audience.
Yeah, this is about his resentment of himself. What do you know, or what do you believe as to when that started, and if you believe believes as to why that came about, when and why?
The resentment towards him being Jewish, or the resentment towards him as a...
they described it as self-hatred. I guess that's the word they used. I didn't want to use that phrase.
Well, it's always hard to, be the amateur psychologist here, but I think that's something... Pardon me? The resentment, you mean, I think it's something he carried with him all his life. And one of the women whom we interviewed here said on another occasion that he hadn't really been happy in his entire life, one single day. No, I think this, I think this was come with him becoming a refugee, having to flee. I think he was a pretty, from what we gather, a happy boy until he was 14 and had to leave the country and leave his existence and leave his family and leave everything that, specified who he was.
Great. We have a center question.
My question or questions revolve around the criteria and requirements that he was instrumental in developing when he was the head of the Institute regarding what Swedish films could be made. My question is, do those requirements, are they still in place? And if they are, did this film have to be vetted by them? And if so, do you think he would have thought that it should have cleared these hurdles, this movie about him?
That's a very good question. Well, as of his standards, I mean, they are still in place. Well, he constructed this film agreement, which is very much about what is quality and what do we, define as quality. And he wasn't scared of trying to define it, which of course is a hopeless thing to do. So this film agreement was still in existence up until January 1 this year, so it lasted for 50 years. That says something of his legacy. And it's also interesting because I work at the Swedish Film Institute, Harry's creation, and some of the film consultants, which are always there, when filmmakers want to get money for their projects, and as we... Commissioning editors, yes, exactly. And if you look at their, workplaces and their modals, and some of them you can find a little piece of paper, which is a list, Harry's criteria, the one that we're also showing in the film, his 10 checkpoints for what defines quality. Well, your second question I wouldn't dare to answer, but we are pretty sure he would be besides himself with joy and find it perfectly logical and natural that an entire feature documentary film is made about him. So much I can guarantee, but the rest, what do you think?
I think he would have also liked the fact that it's actually four, the three of us directors and the woman producer, the 4 women spent this much time on him. I think he would have liked that too.
And I'm sure he would love to be shown in Castro.
Yes.
That is something truly fantastic to be able to screen the film in this theater. It must be the most beautiful cinema theater in the world. Yeah.
And he always saw himself, he thought of the United States as his second country. He loved being here. So coming back like this, I'm sure would have delighted him.
I know there's one more question in the audience, but I just wanted to ask actually about these, points, the quality points, and the fact that this, as of January 1 this year, there's a new day. So is there a democratization happening in Swedish film around more diversity of voices telling stories? And we see the political upheaval with Roy Andersson and others, in the political moment. But what about now? What are the young filmmakers of today doing? And how does this sort of old school way of looking at things fall away in the new era?
I would say that the criteria that Harry set up are still applicable, and they're open-ended enough that they are not excluding neither diversity or a multitude of voices, and that was actually something that he encouraged in those criteria. And I think that the Swedish Film Institute have gone by that. The big change now is how the funding is just funneled into the Swedish Film Institute. It used to be something that was an agreement with all the parties in the film industry, producers, movie theaters, et cetera, and now it is a stately funded body. So that is the main change and shift. I would say that a lot of, like Harry was saying too, even in the 60s, a lot of the young filmmakers actually did get their films funded by the Swedish Film Institute, just not all of them. And that is, of course, always the dilemma. Everybody wants to make a movie. The Swedish Film Institute still does not support all movies, only some that they deem. And I would say that, yes, they do take into account diversity and multitude of voices. And we see some young filmmakers that are doing some interesting work. Ruben Östlund recently, he's not that young, but he's definitely coming from an outside position.
Who won the Cannes Film Festival?
Palme d'Or with The Square. So.
Yeah. We have one final question on the far right over here.
Hi, my name is Karen Schein. My father was Harry Schein's first cousin.
Oh, wow.
Hi. And I very much enjoyed the film. I only met Harry once.
Oh, wow.
And it was at a dinner, and he was drinking whiskey. I can attest he was very fond of the whiskey. I want to mention that his sister Lisa, Elizabeth, lived in San Francisco, and her two sons, Matthew and Christopher, also reached out to Harry, and she did repeatedly, and he really had no interest in being in contact with his nephews, with his sister, with Tom, with my father. That was a chapter that was closed for him. I think the moment that he left Vienna and went to Sweden. And I think Lisa, his sister, really carried great sorrow that she couldn't see him and be in touch with him. But the film was very well done, and I really appreciated seeing it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I actually recall, there is a letter, I think, from your father when Harry was, believe it or not, on the cover of Time magazine or something, and I think your father wrote to Harry at that instant, and Harry said, well, basically, if we haven't met now, why would we meet? Okay. Oh.
To just reach out. And Harry wrote back, he said, I don't like my sister and I don't like you either.
Oh, no.
Wow.
He hurt so many people.
Yeah. He just really had, although when I saw him, he was already quite old. And it was near the time of his death, before. And he came to San Francisco, and at that time we all saw each other. But he really wasn't interested in his family.
No.
Well, it sounds like a good thing that happened was the connection that you all were able to make when you found out that his sister was here. So, wow, only at the Jewish Film Festival. So thank you all so much for coming. It's been an honor, and I hope you'll stick around for the next show.